Hi, everyone. So we've spoken about frontier Islam, the type of Islam that was basically around in Anatolia in the 1300s, 1400s, as the Ottomans were coming to be. We still haven't spoken about what it actually means to become Muslim. How did people become Islamicized? And again, the point is here is that initially, again, most people are not Muslim, they're Christian. By 1500, at least 90% of the population is Muslim, and in some areas it's up to 98%. Um, One of the points that I wanted to make in the previous lesson is, well, when we think about the type of Islam that was in this area, especially on the frontier, it was quite different than what you might find in the cities in within Anatolia, and probably very different from what you would find in places like Iran or in Cairo, etc. So, what I want to figure out is how did the population of Anatolia become Muslim? Was it a migration of Muslims or was it a displacement of Christians? A bit of both. Did the actual native inhabitants become converted? What was going on here? Because this kind of settled, or at least touches upon a lot of the major questions, which is what was ultimately the impact of the movement of these nomadic tribes into Anatolia. So um, we have a variety of sources to look at. As always, we've looked at things like pioneer tales, frontier tales, etc. But those don't necessarily give a full, let's say, objective picture about what's happening on the ground in terms of location. One thing we can turn to is essentially DNA. Look at whether the DNA of local villagers today reflects or from graveyards even. Do we see migration, Central Asian uh, genomes, etc., within the population in ancient DNA there or not? So this hasn't been done very widely, but if we look at places like Saganossos, etc., which is a place in Western Anatolia, you do find that most of the population is actually locals, that there hasn't been much migration from Central Asia, at least in that one place. Of course, it could be different if we did have many more samples, but we don't, unfortunately. Um, so that suggests that the majority of the population actually converted. And one of the things we have to think about is what does a conversion look like, especially in the world of frontier Islam? Is it a purposeful choice? Is it a declaration of faith? Are you leaving one community and joining the other? Or is it more a slow change of daily habits until after many generations, two or three, four generations, you decide maybe, okay, I should call myself a Muslim, or you start naming your kid Ahmed, or you give all these other markers that slowly move you towards a different, slightly different community, even if you're not necessarily, praying at a mosque, etc. And in fact, most of these villages wouldn't have had mosques or even churches for that matter. What they would have had is, again, shrines where people would have come to pray at, and those appealed to both Christians and Muslims. And in fact, often they were very much one and the same. Christian shrines and holy sites just turned into Muslim ones. So which institutions change daily religious life? What can we actually say about daily religious life in medieval Anatolia? We tend to think of mosques and madrasas as the spaces of Islam. Madrasas are sort of like universities. Mosques are where people come for congregational prayers. But the interesting thing is that in medieval Anatolia, so we're thinking about between 100, 1400, sultans and many others weren't really interested in building mosques. The ones that do exist were built in cities, often sponsored by artisans who are migrating from Iran. The same was, true for madrasas. Instead, what they liked to build was not giant mosques all over the place, but things like palaces and what are called caravanserais, basically hotels for caravans and travelers. And they also built lodges and shrines. In other words, what they were building is a gigantic architecture of hospitality across medieval Anatolia. Um, these caravanserais and the lodges essentially provided any traveler coming there free lodging and shelter. for their animals, food. Usually you got all of this for 3 days for free. And then you also provided space for religious services. So there might be a small mosque there, and also a small hospital. You could get treated for illnesses. All of this being free of charge. Why are they called caravanserais? Because caravan is what we call a caravan. In this case, a caravan of camels or mules. And sarai just means palace in Persian and Turkish. And so many of these things were built that they basically created a gigantic network of roads and infrastructure across medieval Anatolia during the Seljuk periods between 1100 and 1300. You can see the green dots are caravanserais, basically populating the entire interior between this part of Anatolia to the northeast and also the north here. And so because caravanserais were places where you could be hosted and included many travelers, it also probably included a lot of people who would come in from the countryside to possibly trade or sell their services to the various caravans, etc., or just came in for curiosity. And this is probably the first and only time they would ever encounter a mosque. And in that mosque, there might be a muezzin, that is someone who announces a call to prayer, and a preacher. So for Christians and nomadic Turks, this would be probably the first and only time they would ever see a mosque. Otherwise, there really weren't any mosques around. But this might be a place where they kind of formally see Islam as a practiced religion and see it as something different. And this is one space of encounter where they would initially become understood. More commonly, though, what they would find is the Sufi lodge, the so-called Zawiya or Tekke. And we talked briefly about these T-shaped lodges. Today, these are transformed into mosques, but they would have a congregational space for prayer, but they're mostly there to host people in these tamkhanes, the fire rooms, where they basically cooked and gave people a warm space to stay for 3 days. Most of these are located in the countryside next to villages. And the whole point was, again, just to give people a space to stay. So we see this in different, this is a very fancy one in Bursa. And often these lodges were tied to more than just Sufi orders. In fact, they were sometimes tied to groups called futuwa, or extra double here, but futawa. Fata is like the name in Arabic is basically a young man or youngster. It has basically means like a brave teenager, essentially. And that's where you also get in Persian the name Javan Mardi, kind of manliness, chivalry. And these are basically associations. They're spaces in which members join together for camaraderie, for social capital, to find some sort of brotherhood. And most of the time they're from artisanal classes. That is, not poor people, not farmers. They are people in cities, and they are also relatively skilled laborers. They start off in Baghdad in the 12th century, but they pick up pretty quickly, and they actually take off in Anatolia and Iran in the 13th and 14th centuries. So right at the same time as we have kind of expansion of Turkish tribes and other things into Anatolia. Long story short, they created these lodges. You can imagine we have kind of the version of this in America in the 20th century, the Elks Lodge or the Shriners or whatever, these groups in which just men would come together and hang out and create some sort of brotherhood. And this created a very strong esprit de corps. In fact, what they would do is they not only live together, often in these lodges, they would work together, pray together, eat together, do everything together. And they developed very complex ceremonies and rule books and even had rivalries with each other. Now, what's interesting about these things is that some of them were just for Muslims, some of them were just for Christians, but there was also a lot of let's say, co-educational, or spaces that included both Muslims and Christians. And so it was a place in which Christians were integrated increasingly with their Muslim neighbors, and introduced to Islam, invited to the mosque, invited to go to a Sufi lodge, etc., and slowly brought into the fold in that sense. So again, it's not an outright conversion. It's a slow transformation of daily habits over the course of 1, 2, 3 generations. And we can see this type of stuff all over Eastern Anatolia. So if we go to graveyards and so forth uh, in Eastern Anatolia, we see this, for example, Jewish gravestones in the different cemeteries. And one of the things, you also find Armenian gravestones, and you can find in them one side in Armenian and one side in Arabic. Arabic because that would have been the official language of kind of religious stuff. Now, what's interesting is if you were to compare the Armenian inscription here, you have a very Christian inscription, about someone dying and being a martyr. He died and became worthy of Christ's light. He died and became worthy of Christ's mercy. And he says, I, Tava, a doctor of all diseases, remember me in your name. So as a doctor, he died in the year 801 in the Armenian calendar. But the Arabic one also calls him a martyr, calls him an akhi, right? So one of these brothers, and it gives him an Arabic name, Tawakkul. And it gives, again, the official name at that time, this official date, so around 1351. What this means is that these people often carry kind of two identities, melding them perfectly well for whatever context that they were in. And we see this in other forms of religious syncretism at that time. So we see this on the coins. Coins are always interesting because they're probably the most easily visible image that people would encounter in their daily lives. You would not have paintings or images everywhere like we do today, but you do use coins regularly to buy things. And if you would look at the coin, you would always have an image and some text there. And when you look at the coins, what you find is that they often copy Christian images and in Byzantine artwork. So here's an icon of St. George slaying the dragon. It's a very common vision of a saint and an icon. And you see the same iconography used on the coins made by Danishmends, one of the Turkish emirates, and the same with the Seljuks as well. It's in 1200, 1178. You see basically a man on the horse with a spear. You can see an even closer one of poking a dragon. Here the dragon's been turned into a little leaf. And on the other side, you would basically have Arabic or Persian declaring the name of the king who puts out the coin. Similarly, we have all sorts of Christian shrines taking on basically a Muslim identity as well, engaging both of those at the same time. Today, they're mostly known through their Muslim side, but for a long time, they were also essentially dual purposes. So shrines to St. George, to St. Theodore, and Elijah become Muslim shrines to a guy named Hizr. Hizr is known as the Green Man. He has a life in both Persian mythology and in Quranic mythology. He sort of accompanies Moses and guides Moses in the Quran. But he also accompanies Alexander the Great in the Persian mythology, leading him to the Fountain of Youth. Alexander never makes it there, but Hizr does, and he ends up drinking it and becomes this sort of eternal man, the embodiment of spring. And there's all these sort of spring rites and spring celebrations dedicated to him, called Hizreles in Turkey. And you can find this all kind of combining different visions of Orthodox Christianity and frontier Islamic life. And we see this in more formal versions. So if we to look different tombs are discovered in Christian spaces. So Batal Ghazi, one of the famous frontier warriors about whom frontier tales are told, the mother of a Seljuk Sultan discovered his grave in a dream in 1207. It turned out to be, he was buried in a Byzantine monastery. That monastery was then converted into a shrine and became a space in which both Muslims and Christians would go into. So questions to think about is, did the Christians participating in these rituals, visiting these shrines, see their lives as a form of conversion? Did they see these actions as specifically Islamic, or did they just see them as continuation of their daily life? And finally, also, how much did people actually have any knowledge of Islam at that time? That is the kind of formal knowledge about how much to pray, what they should know, the Quran as a text that was available. Did they know more about Islam than that it meant to be, a supporter of the Prophet Muhammad, or that Prophet Muhammad was a very pious and good person, or that Muslims went to mosques and Sufi lodges? What did it actually mean to be Muslim? And we talked about that in the previous lesson as well. And finally, is it more useful to think of the term Islamization than conversion? Just some thoughts to think about. We'll talk about more soon.